Mashiach ben David, b'meiro yavo yeleinu, yavo yeleinu. Hi Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David. Chaver, I'm not sure if you noticed, and I forgot to mention earlier, but this evening, the Siyata Dishmaya is being recorded. You can see these two little big mics on the sides of the stage. And it's taking all of you in because that's the only way I decided to make another album. To B'chevra with me, enough of my only my voice. So we need harmony, we need your clapping, we need your energy, we need everything. Please help us out.
Oh, we've got such a big night. Wow. And that was the perfect song to bring us in. That was Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the Prophet by Rabbi Shlomo Katz from Israel. Good evening. It's Tuesday. We've got a big daf, a big page. This is going to knock your socks off, but there's a lot to cover. Let's light up the darkness. All right, who's going to be with us on this special show? Stephen Gigier from Dover, New Hampshire, Carol from Ohio, Ed from Galloway, New Jersey, Paula Schmidt-Klauser from Chicago, Melissa from Great Neck, New York. Nestor says, Happy Yom Kippur a few days early. Yehudit from Florence, South Carolina. Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey. Nancy from North Carolina. James from Indianapolis. Paul from Minneapolis. Colin. Colin asked the question about the title. The title is, how do we know the Messiah will not come on Shabbos? He says, is it because on Shabbat we already have everything we need? Good guess, but not the reason the Talmud gives, as we'll see. Gwen, good evening from Michigan. Wadeline from East Boca, Florida. Michelle from Texas. Lucy from Minneapolis. Marcella from Carlsbad, New Mexico. Now in Midland, Texas. Christine from Canada. From Canada, is that a place? Brenda from South Louisiana, Gloria from North Carolina, Hannah from Mississippi, Wadeline is saying Happy New Year 5781, Susan from Scottsdale, Joanne from Philly, Bill Eldridge in the house from Arkansas, Pedro is with us from Phoenix, Arizona, Brinna. Please daven for Esther Bat Rivka fighting for every precious minute of her life. May we only hear good news. Please, God, send a healing to Esther Bas Rivka. Joanne says, Happy New Year. Jose asks, what song is that? Shlomo Katz, Eliyahu Hanavi. Let me turn off that air conditioning. Sarah from Apple Valley. Jennifer from Hawaii. Ann says shalom. Stephanie says Shana Tova Metuka. Joshua from North Carolina. Eden from Little Rock. Rob from Georgia. Jose from Guatemala. Welcome, Jose from Guatemala. Chaim from Charlotte, Suzanne from Tennessee, Veronica from Brown Mills, Carol. I only do this for the first minute. I usually can get to the bottom of the people who just, yeah, okay. Susan loves that music from Shlomo Katz. Blaine says shalom. Brenda says amen. And Carol is with us from Boston, Mass. Over on the YouTube side, Marjorie is with us from Georgia. If you're a first-timer, let us know so I can welcome you. Nina will slip me the questions and comments a little bit later in the show. All right. First, a clarification from yesterday. We're in the midst of 250 pages of the Talmud dedicated, 250 of the 2,711 total, so almost 10%, is dedicated to Shabbos. So we had 150 pages in Tractate Shabbos. Now we're in Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. In fact, we're on Daf Mem Gimel, page 43. We're in chapter 4, Mishna number 1. So I just wanted to clarify what I said yesterday. When we're talking about Shabbos and specifically the laws of Eruv, what is it that we're trying to accomplish on a biblical level? So it's that commandment to delight in Shabbos. Where does that commandment come from? So the 10 commandments are written twice in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible. The first time in Exodus. And when it says that you shall keep Shabbos, in the 10 commandments, the first time they're recorded in the book of Exodus, it says, remember the Sabbath day. Remember the Shabbos day to keep it holy. Zachor Shabbos. So when we're commanded to remember Shabbos, it means that we do the things that make Shabbos beautiful. We make kiddush on wine. We sanctify the day when we do that. We make a motzi, we make a challah, and then we make a blessing on the challah, and we have a beautiful Shabbos dinner, and we should have 2 meals on Shabbos day so that we have 3 meals during Shabbos. God willing, 3 sumptuous meals so that we will delight in Shabbos. The word to delight in Shabbos, oneg Shabbos, that's actually taken from the book of Isaiah. So that's 58:13. You shall delight. If you will call the Shabbos a delight, if you will restrain your activities, etc., you will make the Lord pleased. You will please the Lord. But this command to delight in Shabbos, that comes from Isaiah. But remember Shabbos, that covers all of the positive actions, the things that we do in order to make Shabbos special. When the 10 commandments are repeated, when they're recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is basically Moses' ethical will to the Jewish people. He restates everything that they've learned. He speaks to them for a month before his death. When they're on the edge, they're on the edge of the Holy Land. They've already wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and they're about to enter the Holy Land. And Moses speaks to them like he knows he's not going to enter with them. He knows he's going to be taken up to heaven. He's not going to be able to enter with them. And he's just giving them all the knowledge and wisdom and strength that he can. And one of the things that he does is he repeats the 10 commandments. When he repeats the 10 commandments, there's a subtle change in the wording of Shabbos. Instead of saying, remember the Sabbath day, he says, Shomer Shabbos, guard the Sabbath day. What does guard the Shabbos day mean? It means don't do the things of the week. Don't do the work of the week, which later the sages defined as the 39 types, the 39 categories of labor that were necessary to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. Those are all kinds of creative, constructive work, making something, doing things that will eventually generate something, including income, so that we don't do that on Shabbos. All of the work activities and even non-work, but clearly weekday activities, which aren't Shabbostic in nature, we don't do them on Shabbos. So we get the source for that is Shomer Shabbos, guard the Sabbath day. Guard the Sabbath days, all the things we don't do. All right. So when we're talking about the laws of Eruv, which allow us to carry in places that we wouldn't be able to carry otherwise, or allow us to walk a certain distance in a direction that we wouldn't be allowed to go otherwise by working with the rules, It's so that we can fulfill that command to remember the Sabbath day, and as it teaches in Isaiah, to delight in the Sabbath day. So those positive actions that we do, including the command to delight in the Sabbath day, that comes from the first stating, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, which we hear in the Ten Commandments in Exodus. Specifically, that's Exodus 27. The repetition of the Ten Commandments is at Deuteronomy, or in Hebrew, Devarim 5:11. All right. I wanted to clarify that from yesterday. We've been discussing the first Mishna of chapter 4, which deals with what happens when a person is taken outside of his Shabbos boundary, meaning the limits of how far he can walk on Shabbos. And so he went further than that against his will. A person moved him out there, a storm moved him out there, an evil spirit moved him out there, as we discussed a couple of days ago. Rav and Shmuel agree that the halacha, the law, follows Rabban Gamliel in that case that we heard in the Mishnah 2 days ago. Recall that Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Yehoshua were all on a boat. They were on the boat before Shabbos began. It wasn't their choice, but they didn't have a choice. The boat set sail on Shabbos. So that certainly wasn't their choice. But the boat started moving on Shabbos, and so they found themselves, they sailed away from port, so they were clearly more than the 2,000 cubits which were allowed to walk in any direction from our Shabbos dwelling. They were more than that. During Shabbos, they found themselves quite a bit further away than that from where they initially had a Shabbos dwelling. When Shabbos started, they were on the ship, but in port. So then the disagreement was, Rabban Gamliel, the Mishnah taught that when you're forced out of your boundary, wherever you're deposited, wherever you land by that force that moved you against your will, you basically have to sit tight there. You can move a little, you have 4 cubits. We always get the 4 cubits which we occupy, so you can move around 4 cubits, like 6 feet in any direction. But that's it, right? So wherever you're deposited. So now they find themselves deposited on a boat. But Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah hold that the boat is like your dwelling, so you get to roam around the whole boat, right? The 4 cubits that you get, if it's within an enclosure, you get to move around that enclosure. If it's within a city, you even get to move around that city. This is in the case where you were moved against your will and found yourself in that new location outside your Sabbath boundary. Rabban Gamliel and Elazar ben Azariah say you can move all around the boat. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehoshua said, no, you only get your 4 cubits. So they just, sat tight in their cabin and didn't roam around the boat. So that's what the Mishnah said. Rav and Shmuel, who are Amoraim, right? So this is a later generation discussing these rulings in the Mishnah. They live in Babylonia. They're discussing rulings that were, codified in the Mishnah in Israel earlier, the generation of the Mishnah. And Rav and Shmuel agree. They usually disagree on everything, but Rav and Shmuel agree that the halacha, the law, follows Rabban Gamliel in this. He was right. They could move all around the boat. One who is set down on a boat may move around the whole boat, as opposed to how Akiva and Yehoshua said that they could stay in there, they must stay in their 4 cubits. Why is the question? What is the reasoning? How do we know that Rabban Gamliel was right? Elazar ben Azariah agreed with him, but it was Rabban Gamliel, who's the Nasi, he's the chief rabbi in his generation, the head of the Sanhedrin. So he made the ruling. Akiva and Yehoshua sort of dissented in this situation, and they were more stringent with themselves and just stayed in their cabin. But Rav and Shmuel discussing this are asking, how do we know that Rabban Gamliel was correct? Rabba offers this reasoning. The reason we know that it was correct to move around the boat is because they were on the boat before Shabbos began. So since they were on the boat before Shabbos began, they acquired as their Shabbos residence, like their dwelling is in their cabin, let's say, on the boat, but that cabin is within an enclosure. What is the enclosure? The boat. The boat is the enclosure. So since there's the sides of the boat, and the sides of the boat always extend upwards of the deck itself, let's say. These are called the gunwales, right? So kind of the walls around the boat so that people walking on deck don't just fall off the boat. So that constitutes an enclosure. And so they acquired as their dwelling before Shabbos began the whole boat, because they were within those enclosures. And so it makes sense that even if the whole boat has moved, they have as their dwelling the whole boat. They can roam around the boat. Rabbi Zeira says that's not the reason. Rabbi Zeira says it's different than that. The reason they can move around the boat is because we've learned already that if you're taken against your will outside of your boundary, their boundary was 2,000 cubits from where they were when Shabbos began in the port. Then the boat set sail after Shabbos started, and then it went way out of that, 2,000 cubits from the port. And so they, against their will, left their Sabbath boundary. At that point, they're supposed to be limited to the 4 cubits in which they're sitting. But you always get to walk 4 cubits from where you are. And where you are on a boat that is sailing keeps changing, right? Since the boat is moving, then you always get 4 cubits from where you are until you move again. Well, the boat, at every moment, the boat is moving. So at any moment, you can go 4 cubits from where you are. So then let's say you take 3 steps. Well, the boat moved during that time. So that was against your will, circumstances beyond your control. So every time you take a few steps, your origin of where the 4 cubits start is new. So you could just keep walking, and you're always getting 4 cubits from a new spot with every step because the boat is moving, and those are circumstances beyond your control. It's a little hard to explain. I hope you're following me. But this idea that since the boat is always moving, you can always take 4 steps from where you are, but where you are is reset every moment because the boat keeps moving. The Gemara asks, my benehu. This is an important question. It's Aramaic. It comes up a lot in the Talmud. What is between them? In other words, what is the practical ramification of these 2 reasons that are offered for why Rabban Gamliel was right that you could roam around the boat? Right? That Rabba gave a different reason that you can roam around the boat because you had the whole enclosure of the boat, which you acquired when Shabbos set in. And Rabbi Zeira says you can move around because you can always move 4 cubits from where you are, and where you are keeps changing because the boat is in motion. What is the practical difference between these 2 explanations, the Rabba's and Rabbi Zeira's? So first, if the walls of the boat are partitions, and that's the reason we can move around, well, if something happens to the gunwales of the boat, those fences around the upper deck of the boat that constitute the partitions surrounding this private domain enclosure, that we're saying the boat is like a private domain. It's an enclosure enclosed by these partitions of the gunwales. But if they're breached, right, if there's a hole in the gunwales of the boat, well, then that private domain is invalidated. So if for some reason that wall falls out, there's no longer the private domain. In fact, some ships have that as a feature, that they would just lower that fence for some reason, maybe for people to go fishing or trap shooting or something, on cruise ships. And now that partition's no longer there. So at that point, they would lose that permit to go walking all around the boat because that enclosure is no longer complete, right? If more than 10 cubits of that enclosure was breached, was dropped, was destroyed, as it were, it would be invalidated. Or if you started on this boat and for some reason you jumped onto another boat, then you would also lose your ability to roam around the new boat. Whereas under Rabbi Zeira's reasoning, since you're in motion and you didn't choose that, it's against, you're not choosing the motion of the boat. You wouldn't be sailing at all since it's Shabbos, but somebody else is controlling the boat, a non-Jew. So if you now find yourself in a new boat, well, you didn't have that boat's partitions when you started Shabbos. So if now you're in this new boat, you'd definitely be limited to your 4 cubits. if the reason that you can move around the boat is because you acquired this enclosure as your Shabbos dwelling when Shabbos began. But if the reason you can move all around is because you're on a ship that's in motion and you can always go 4 cubits in any direction and you can keep moving that, then you could keep moving around the boat even if you're put on a new boat during Shabbos. Okay. And note that if you're relying on these partitions and they're breached and now you can no longer move around, except you're stuck in the 4 cubits. Well, if the partitions are breached in such a way that the ship is now sinking, well, of course you can move out of your 4 cubits because you can always violate Shabbos to save your life, right? So in that case, it wouldn't count. All right. In both of these cases, Rabba's reason no longer applies, right? If the gunwales were breached or if you found yourself on a new ship, so then you would not have that enclosure anymore and you couldn't keep moving around. But Rabbi Zeira's reason would still apply and you could keep moving because you're on a ship in motion. All right. Nevertheless, so even though it seems like Rabbi Zeira's explanation applies in some situations where Rabba's doesn't, Rabba's is simpler, right? This idea that I have to explain to you that I can keep moving because the boat is in motion and the center of my 4 cubits keeps moving and that's why I can keep walking, like that's complicated. Rabba's reason is much simpler. I acquired my dwelling within an enclosure when Shabbos began. Why doesn't Rabbi Zeira subscribe to Rabba's reasoning, asks the Gemara. And the reason is because we're calling the sides of the boat an enclosure for the purpose of, enclosing land, as it were, right? Normally, when we're on land, an enclosure encloses a certain piece of property and excludes the rest of the world, right? It separates this enclosed property from the rest of the world. But the sides of a ship don't exist in order to enclose, this property and distinguish it from the rest of the world. The sides of the ship exist to keep the water out so that the ship is still floating. So they weren't built to be a partition in the same way as when we're talking about partitions that create an enclosure of holiness that we can carry within or we can roam around in this situation that we're talking about. So that's why Rabbi Zeira says, no, Rabba, you're relying on partitions, but the sides of the boat weren't built as partitions. Okay, so now we have 2 reasons. Rabbi Zeira's explanation applies in more situations and isn't based on partitions that really weren't built to be partitions. So why doesn't Rabba subscribe to Rabbi Zeira's reasoning that the reason Rabban Gamiliel ruled that we can move all around the boat is because the boat is in motion and the center of our 4 cubits keeps moving with us every time we take a step because the boat is moving? Why doesn't Rabba hold like Rabbi Zeira? And the answer is Rabbi Zeira's logic is great, but it only applies if the boat is moving. If the boat is not moving, if the boat is stationary, let's say it's dropped anchor or it's reached another port, then presumably this idea that we can keep moving all around the ship because every time we take a step, we have a new spot where the 4 cubits is centered. But now the ship is not moving. So according to Rabbi Zeira, we can't move around. And Rabban Gamliel seems to say, is that what Rabban Gamliel said? Right? That if the ship were not moving, we would be limited to our 4 cubits? Or was he saying that we could move around it even if the ship stopped? Indeed, all agree that the halacha is that one can roam around a ship that is moving and one can roam around a stationary ship as long as the walls have not been breached. So it's almost like a hybrid, taking both in mind, right? Rabbi Zeira's explanation and Rabba's explanation. Or you can say it's really like Rabbi Zeira, because since it says that if the boat is stopped, we can keep roaming around unless the walls are breached. That really sounds like it's Rabba. Okay. So then the question is, well, if they really had a good reason for roaming around the ship, according to Rabban Gamliel, the way he held, and he's the Nasi, why were Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehoshua stringent? Why were they stringent? It seems like they had a perfectly valid permission to move around. And it seems like they were stringent on themselves because they're prominent people. They knew that they could move around, but they were concerned that if others saw them moving around, simple Jews who don't have such an education, they would come to think, oh, once you're on a boat, you can always move all around the boat, even if you've left your Shabbos boundary, etc. But actually, if the boat is not moving, maybe you could move around, maybe you can't, depending on when you entered that boat. And if the gunwales were breached, if something like the fence was lowered, and then you no longer have that partition, and people might not understand, they might get the wrong idea. And that's one explanation why Akiva and Yehoshua were stringent with themselves. But in fact, we hear later that what did they do when they were stringent with themselves and spent the whole day inside their 4 cubits while Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah were roaming all about the ship? Akiva and Yehoshua were talking about this. Did we rule correctly? And in the end, they concluded that they were wrong. They should have they should have held according to what Rabban Gamliel said, and they were permitted to roam around the ship, and they should have roamed around the ship, but they didn't because they weren't sure at that moment. All right. Now, we've been talking about this Sabbath boundary, the Shabbos techum, right? That's what it's called, the boundary. How far you can walk from your dwelling, or if your dwelling is in a city, the techum starts at the city limits, and how far you can walk from the city limits, right? So 2,000 cubits in any direction from your dwelling. If your dwelling is in a city, then in any direction from the city limits. What is the source for that? We've just taken it as a given, but what is the biblical source for that rule? Where do we get this? How do the rabbis know that this is so? How they have to base everything that they do somewhere in the Torah, even if it's like, they had to derive it from a verse in the Torah. It's not explicit in the Torah. If it was explicit, it would be a Torah commandment, not a rabbinic decree. But they still have to have some basis in Torah. Where they get it is a verse that we find Exodus 16:29. Which is about Shabbos, right? And this is when the Jews are first learning about Shabbos in the wilderness. And they're going to have the manna, right? So they're going to be, during all their years in the wilderness, what are they eating? There's 2 million people wandering around the wilderness. They have some livestock with them, but it would not be enough to feed these 2 million people. What are they eating? They're eating, in Hebrew, the mun, or in English, manna. Right? Manna. It's bread from heaven. It appears every morning on the ground. We have a tradition that teaches that there was dew on the ground, or some say a frost on the ground, and then the manna, and then a layer of moisture above it. Right? So it was like sort of the manna, this like precious, delicious food, was protected from the dirt below and anything above by 2 layers of moisture. Some say dew, some say frost, but at any rate, it was protected below and above and below. And people would go out and gather, and some say it tasted, almost like fried dough, and some say it tasted like whatever a person's favorite food was. But they would gather it in the morning, and it would be their food for the day. If they tried to gather more for the next day, it would go rotten the next day. However, on Fridays, they were able to gather a double portion, and it would keep over for Shabbos when they were not allowed to gather, and it wouldn't go rotten the next day. The double portion of Friday would last them for Friday and Saturday. The verse which describes that phenomenon in the desert, Exodus 16:29, behold, the Lord has given you the Shabbos. Therefore, he gives you on the 6th day 2 days of bread. And here's the key line. Each man shall stay put and not leave his place on the 7th day. He shall not leave his place on the 7th day. So what does it mean, not leave your place? Does it mean that everybody has to sit in their tent? I mean, that's not going to be, a delight. Shabbos won't really be a delight if you're confined to your tent like you're in jail. No, of course you can go visiting your friends around the encampment of the children of Israel when we were in the wilderness. But how far can you go is the question. And elsewhere the sages derive, on a biblical level, how far can you go? 12 mil, which is about 8 miles, right? That's a long way. But the rabbis decreed that it was actually much less. In order to have a real Shabbos that feels like a Shabbos, you can only go 2,000 cubits, which is about 2/3 of a mile. Okay. Rav Chananya asks a question, and this is going to lead us to the title of the show. How do we know that Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, the son of David, right, a descendant of King David, how do we know that Mashiach ben David will not arrive on Shabbos? This is where we're headed. The question that initiates this discussion, Rav Chananya asks, does the Techem, the Shabbos boundary, the limit that you can only walk 2,000 cubits from your dwelling, apply if you're moving above 10 handbreadths from the ground? We've seen before this measure, 10 handbreadths, 10 tefachim. That's the limit of the public domain, right? Above 10 handbreadths above the ground in a public domain is no longer the public domain. It's an exempt area. It's the airspace above the public domain, and it's not the public domain. So Rav Chananya is asking, well, if you somehow move through the air instead of walking along the ground, are you still limited to that 2,000 cubits? That's the question. All right. So that's what we're discussing. The first attempt to answer the question. Well, it must apply. How do we know? Because this Mishna that we're discussing, where Rabban Gamliel and Elazar ben Azariah and Akiva and Yehoshua were on a boat, and Akiva and Yehoshua were stringent with themselves because, right, they were outside their boundary. They moved 2,000 cubits away from where their dwelling was. Now they're out at sea somewhere. It must be that they left their boundary. What does this have to do with moving more than 10 handbreadths above the ground? Is it because they're 10 handbreadths above the surface of the water? No. When we're talking about a boat on water, we're still measuring from the ground. They are more than 10 handbreadths above the seabed or the ocean bed or the river bed. Whatever body of water they're on, we still measure from the ground that's below them. So they are certainly higher than 10 handbreadths above the seabed that their boat is traveling over. And they're still worried about their Shabbos boundary. So it must be that that boundary does apply even if you're moving more than 10 handbreadths above the ground. Rava says, no, you've misunderstood the story. Actually, the boat was moving in a swamp, a shallow swamp. So they were within 10 handbreadths of the ground. We don't know if the Shabbos boundary applies and limits our movement if we're moving more than 10 handbreadths above the ground. So the Gemara brings in a story. There was an incident where 7 teachings regarding trephos, right? So they were teachings about kashrus, about what animals are permitted to be eaten by Jews and which are not. We don't have to go into what those teachings were. The point is that these 7 teachings about what's kosher to eat were shared in front of Rav Chisda in the city of Sura in Babylonia on Shabbos morning, on Saturday morning. And the same 7 teachings were shared by the same person in front of Rava in the city of Pumbedisa in Babylonia on Shabbos afternoon, the same Shabbos. Now let me show you. You can see this little map here. All right, so that's the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And I don't know if you can read it, but the top city there is Pumbedisa, and the lowest city is Sura, and the one in between is Nehardea. So those 2 cities, which lie on the Euphrates River, are about 100 kilometers apart, 60 miles apart. So there's no way that a person can stay within their Shabbos boundary and be in both of those cities on the same Shabbos. And somehow somebody was in both of those cities on the same Shabbos and shared those 7 teachings before the chief rabbi in each city, right? Because Rava was the chief rabbi in Pumbedisa, and Rav Chisda was the chief rabbi in Sura in that generation. And this person shared 7 teachings before them on the same Shabbos. So, first of all, who could move 60 miles in one day, in a time before there were cars? Even on horseback, you're going to have a tough time making 60 miles. And this is obviously a Jew, right, who's sharing these 2 teachings. So how could he possibly be in both places on the same Shabbos? It must be that the person who was sharing those 7 teachings about kashrut, about what's kosher, was Elijah the prophet. We have a tradition in the Talmud that who is it that's able to move around kind of magically and appear here and appear there and share wisdom from heaven and things, sort of pearls of wisdom or information that needs to be conveyed from heaven to us? Who is it that does that? Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. So since this person was magically in both those places that are so far apart on the same Shabbos, it must have been Eliyahu Hanavi. So if Eliyahu Hanavi was in both cities at once in both cities on the same Shabbos, how did he get from one to the other? He must have made a miraculous leap. If Eliyahu Hanavi made a miraculous leap from one city to the other, it must be that the Sabbath, the restriction of the Sabbath boundary does not apply above 10 handbreadths above the ground, right? Since he must have moved through the air from Sura to Pumbedisa. Was that the order? From Pumbedisa to Sura? Let me just make sure I get it right. From Sura to Pumbedisa. So it must be that Elijah moved through the air above 10 handbreadths above the ground, and therefore we know that the restriction on moving beyond your Shabbos boundary doesn't apply if you're moving through the air more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, according to this story, the way that it's being brought here. Right? Well, not quite. First of all, we have a question. Why would the Sabbath boundary apply to, why can we learn whether the Sabbath boundary applies to us when we move over, 10 handbreadths above the ground, according to a story about Eliyahu Hanavi? What happened to Elijah when he died? He didn't die, right? The story of Elijah the prophet is he didn't die. When he reached the end of his journey on earth, a chariot of fire came and took him straight up to heaven. And then he basically became an angel. So if Elijah is a spirit creature now, he's not like us. So what difference does it make what the law is of the Sabbath boundary? He's beyond that. But we also know from this story that somebody taught these 7 teachings in Surah in the morning and in Pumbedisa in the afternoon, where in the study hall. So how were these things taught? They were taught by a person in a body. And the Chasam Sofer answers, how is this possible? Eliyahu Hanavi shuttles back and forth between heaven and earth. That is true. Elijah the prophet can go operate in both realms. When he comes down here, sometimes he moves around like an angel. He is unseen, and that's why he's understood to be a guest at every bris. Every time there's a circumcision welcoming a new Jewish boy into the covenant of the Jews, Eliyahu Hanavi is at that celebration. But when he's speaking with somebody and interacting with us, then he goes back into his body. Because when he went up to heaven in that chariot of fire, he actually left his body down here in storage. And anytime he needs to appear down here and actually interact with people, then he's in his body. So since he was in his body to deliver those teachings, he used his body when he made that miraculous leap. And so it does appear that the Sabbath boundary does not apply when we move more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, right? No. The Gemara says, no, this is no proof. We don't know for sure that it was Elijah the prophet who delivered those two teachings. It might have been Yosef the Demon. Yosef the Demon appears in a few places in the Talmud. Who is Yosef the Demon? He's an interesting character. He is a person who knows the law but doesn't follow it, right? So it may be that the boundary does apply and we're not allowed to travel more than 2,000 cubits on Shabbos, even if we're moving more than 10 handbreadths off the ground. But Yosef the Demon isn't Shomer Shabbos. He doesn't care if he violates Shabbos, so he might move even if that's true. Why was he giving teachings on, what's kosher to eat, which animals are kosher to eat, and why were they listening to him if he was Yosef the Demon? Not explained in this tale. So we still don't know if the Shabbos boundary applies when one travels more than 10 handbreadths off the ground. So the Gemara is going to bring another source, another teaching that may help us understand this question. If one takes a vow of nazirus, so if a person takes a vow to become a nazir is like, I hate when I do this. I wasn't, I only thought of this example just now. What's this famous guy's name who was so strong and then they cut his hair and then he lost all his strength? Samson, right? So Samson from the book of Judges, he was a nazir, right? From when he was born. So a nazir, two things. He can't cut his hair and he can't drink wine. So if somebody takes a vow to become a nazir, but he says it's a conditional vow, I'm going to become a nazir and I will never taste, products of grapes and particularly wine during my nazirist period. Usually when people would take that vow, it was for 30 days or 60 days, like a finite amount of time. Some people, for some reason could take that vow for the rest of their lives. This person who takes the vow in this example says, I will become a nazir on the day that Mashiach ben David comes. When the Messiah arrives and we enter the Messianic age, on that day, I vow to become a nazir. So that's the vow. The teaching is, if somebody takes that vow, he is permitted to drink wine on Shabbos and holidays, Shabbos and Yom Tov. He is not permitted to drink wine on weekdays. Why? On weekdays, it might be that the Mashiach has arrived and he just hasn't heard about it yet. So since he vowed that on the day the Mashiach comes, he will become a nazir, so he has to be able to fulfill his vow, even though he might not have the full information. He didn't say, I will become a nazir when I hear that the Mashiach has arrived. He said, I will become a nazir on the day Mashiach arrives. So just in case he hasn't heard, he has to assume that every day it's possible that the Mashiach came. So then why can't he drink wine on Shabbos and Yom Tov? It must be that we know that the Mashiach will not come on Shabbos or Yom Tov, Shabbos or a holiday. How do we know that the Mashiach will not come on Shabbos or Yom Tov? How do we know? First of all, before we explain that, we'll say since we know that the Mashiach will not come on Shabbos or Yom Tov, it must be that, wait, let me get this right. So it must be that the Techem applies above 10 Tefachim. It must be that the Sabbath boundary applies above the 10 handbreadths. And that's why the Messiah won't come on Shabbos or the holiday, because he can't travel on that day. He's going to be limited to wherever his dwelling is. He's not going to be able to travel into the earth and, announce his presence to the whole world. And it must be because he can't travel on Shabbos, and therefore the Sabbath boundary applies. The Gemara says, no. That's not the reason. It has nothing to do with the Sabbath boundary. The reason that we know that Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, the descendant of King David, is not coming on Saturday or the holiday is because on the day before Mashiach comes, Eliyahu Hanavi will announce that the Messiah is coming. The day before the Messiah comes, Elijah the prophet will announce to the world that the Mashiach is coming the next day. How do we know that? That is from Malachi 3. This is the last book of the prophets, right? The Bible is divided into the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, right? So the last book of the prophets is Malachi. He was the last prophet. And we read actually this prophecy every year as Passover approaches. This quote actually appears at the beginning of our movie, When Do We Eat?, that Nina and I wrote and I directed, a comedy about Passover. Hilarious, irreverent, a little edgier than we might make it if we made it today, but still, hilarious and filled with Torah. But at any rate, this quote from Malachi says, "Behold, I send you Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord, and he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or I will come," God speaking, "and strike the land with utter destruction." At any rate, I will send you Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the coming of the Lord, which is when the Mashiach is coming. Okay. So Elijah is coming the day before Mashiach comes, all right? And we have a tradition that Elijah will not come on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tov. Not Erev, but Erev, meaning the eve of. In other words, he will not come the day before Shabbos or the day before a holiday. Why? Why will Elijah not come on Friday or on the day before a holiday? Because he doesn't want to inconvenience the Jewish people. The Jewish people have been promised that we have a tradition that Elijah will not come on a Friday. Why? Because on Friday, we're busy getting ready for Shabbos. We're cooking, we're making 3 sumptuous meals so that we can delight in Shabbos. And Shabbos is still going to happen when the Messiah comes, right? So we're always going to be preparing for Shabbos on Fridays, even in the Messianic age. And so that we don't have to interrupt our preparations to go welcome Elijah, who's heralding the coming of the Messiah the next day. And then we would be verklempt because we wouldn't finish our Shabbos preparations or our holiday preparations. We have a tradition that Elijah will not come on a Friday or the day before a holiday. He won't come on that day. And since he won't come on Friday, the Messiah will not come on Saturday. Since Elijah will not come on the day before a holiday, the Messiah will not come on a holiday. That's how we know. And should you think that the Messiah, well, if Elijah won't come on a Friday in order not to inconvenience us when we're preparing for Shabbos, and I'm almost at the end of my teaching, so if you have a question or comment, please put in the comments, and Nina's going to slip those to me. Should you think that since Elijah won't come on Friday, the day before Shabbos, or on the day before any holiday, so that he won't inconvenience us when we're preparing for Shabbos or the holiday, that therefore the Messiah also will not come on Friday or the day before a holiday for the same reason, so he won't inconvenience us as we're preparing for the Shabbos or for the holiday? You don't need to think that. Why not? Because when the Messiah comes, the world is going to be so excited, and the whole world is going to realize that the Torah has been speaking the truth all along, and that the Jews have been caretakers for the truth all along. And so at that moment, all of the non-Jews of the world will look for a Jew and say, oh, I just want to help out. I just want to be part of this, right? I can't become a Jew on that day. Non-Jews, we have a tradition elsewhere, you won't be able to convert to Judaism after the Messiah comes. If you're thinking about converting to Judaism, make sure you do it before the Messiah comes. But you don't have to convert. You can still enjoy the Messiah completely. You don't have to be a Jew at all. But the non-Jews are just going to want to attach themselves to the Jew so that they could just be part of that community, right? Not as Jews, but as sort of allies and friends of the Jews. And so they'll just go find a Jew and help them prepare for Shabbos. So when the Messiah comes, if he should happen to come on a Friday or the day before a holiday, we'll be able to welcome him and celebrate and still have plenty of time to get ready for Shabbos because we'll have lots of help cooking those 3 meals for the Sabbath or for the festival, because people will just be looking for a Jew to help out in that situation on the day that the Messiah arrives. So, what have we learned? Did we learn that the Messiah isn't going to come on Saturday because you have a Shabbos boundary and you can't, and it applies even above 10 handbreadths above the ground? No, we didn't learn that. The reason he's not coming on a Saturday is because Elijah's not coming on Friday. And the same for the festival and the day before the festival. So at the end of the day, we don't know. We do not know if the Sabbath boundary, the limit of going 2,000 cubits, applies if one travels above 10 handbreadths above the ground. So, since we don't know, in matters of doubt, when it comes to rabbinic decrees, we're going to be lenient. And when it comes to Torah prohibitions, we're going to be stringent. So if you're going to go more than 2,000 cubits, but you're going to do it above 10 handbreadths above the ground, like you're on a ship, right? Then we're going to be lenient with that situation. But if you're going to go more than 8 miles, which is the biblical limit of how far you can go on Shabbos, then we're going to be stringent even if you're traveling more than 10 handbreadths above the ground. That's all I have for today. I'm going to your comments and questions. If we think about the takeaway of this, I mean, first of all, how beautiful is it that we can learn laws from miraculous stories and from prophecies of the future? How beautiful is it that when Elijah comes to announce the great and awesome day of the Lord, when the Messiah will come and reveal God's presence throughout the world, and everyone will see that God has been here all along, that God has been the king all along, that we're living in God's world, and the knowledge of God will fill the world the way the waters fill the sea. Everyone will see, like you'll just be revealed. This world will still be, a solid and real place, but the presence, the miraculous, majestic, sweet presence of the Lord will be revealed to everybody. But it won't start on Friday with Elijah's coming because he doesn't want to inconvenience us. So because we're getting ready for Shabbos. It's beautiful. By the way, this is the day. This is a line from Psalm 118. It applies to that day, and it also applies to today, right? This is a day, meaning today, even before the Messiah comes, this is a day the Lord made. If you like this shirt, and it says Accidental Talmudist on the back, you can get it at our merchandise shop, which is shop.accidentaltalmudist.org. All right, let's go to questions and comments. All right, there's a few. Michelle Fontenot is a first-timer. Welcome, Michelle. It's so great that you're in our community and learning with us. We hope you'll come back regularly. Pedro Chavez says, my first time here and excited to hear this piece of wisdom. I hope you've had a good learning today, Pedro. Welcome. Brenda Prudhomme Colette, also I'm a first timer. It's great that you're with us, Brenda. This was an exciting day and an unusual day of Talmud learning. Renee Caravello is also a first timer. Welcome, Renee. Sharon Fran Brooks comments, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. I love teaching this lesson to my students. Shamor v'zachor. Guard and remember, Vidibor, this one word, this one thing. Ed Berg, if I had my way, I would tear this old building down. Reminding me Samson and Delilah by the Grateful Dead. And Lucy Ram Johnson, thanks for explaining this page. It had gotten my brain in knots. Right. And you know, it's always a question for me. When I start late, like I'm always getting ready. I start getting ready at about 5:15 for the 6 o'clock show. When I start late, and today I think I started like 6:15 or maybe even later, 6:20, 6:25. It's because the daf is so, like I've already read it this morning. So now I'm reviewing the page that I studied this morning. And I actually studied it twice this morning because it's a tough page. And then in the afternoon, I start preparing my notes to teach it. And I'm always looking for that thread that'll take us through not every beat of the page, but the highlights, the crucial points of the page that I can connect together in a flow that hopefully, you know, the audience can appreciate and follow. Because, you know, the Talmud could just get so complex. I never try to teach the whole page. I always try to teach the crucial concepts of that page. But even just the crucial concepts, to get a flow that I can teach and work my way through, sometimes it just takes me extra time to prepare it. This was a tough page to get ready. But thank God you were with us to hear it. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And Pedro Chavez says, I really, really enjoyed the teaching. So that's awesome. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific on Wednesday. Take care, my holy sisters and brothers.